Mr. Prime Minister, you've said Israel has always been pro-American. Israel will always be pro-American. You yourself spent many years in the United States, as did your father. Tell us a little bit about what is at the heart of Israel's and your affection for the United States.
Common values first. I think the values of freedom, free societies, the idea of individual choice that is enveloped with a collective purpose. And I think that defines Israel, defines America. These are two societies built on a purpose, on the idea of freedom. I've spoken in the Congress a number of times, and each time I look and I see the emblem of Moses in the American Congress. And it says a lot. It's the idea of the promised land, the land of freedom, freedom from bondage, the freedom to pursue your future. So I think this is I would say the identity of conviction. But there's something else that I think has to be seen in a historic context. We were a people scattered among the nations. We had no capacity to defend ourselves, and by dint of historical regularity, we should have disappeared. Most nations that existed in the past do not exist today, and certainly a nation scattered from its land and becoming utterly defenseless, subject to the whims, the worst whims of humanity, should have disappeared. We gathered our resolve, came back to the land of Israel, the promised land, rebuilt our country when we repossessed the power to defend ourselves. But it was said here before that all powers, all countries, even great powers, need alliances. We need an alliance too. We did not have that alliance in the first half of the 20th century, when the founding fathers of Zionism identified the threat of anti-Semitism, the growing threat of anti-Semitism in Europe. We had no capacity yet to build our nation. We built it having lost 6 million of our brethren. And I believe that if the United States had been the preeminent world power in the first half of the 20th century, things might have turned out differently. And yet, Israel was born in mid-century. The United States became the global power at that point. And what a difference it made. It made a difference for the entire world by guaranteeing liberty, by facing down Soviet totalitarianism. It made a difference for us in that we had a partner. And I think that not only the common ideals of Israel and the United States, and they were mentioned here, but I think it's also the role, the active role of the United States in defending liberty around the world and standing by its allies, in this case, the best possible ally of the United States, Israel. I think it's made a world of difference. And I bet on this alliance. I wouldn't sell the United States short, I wouldn't sell Israel short, and I would not at all diminish the importance of this alliance. I think it's pivotal for the future of our world, and if you ask me about it, I'll tell you more. This is what I believe.
I want to ask you...
With a sore throat.
And I have tissues right here, too.
That's all right.
Like the United States, and you...
Oh, okay, sure.
Like the United States, which was founded on a big idea and by a group of people seeking freedom. Israel, too, was founded on a big idea, that of Zionism. But the country's come a long way since 1896, when Herzl wrote The Jewish State.
Right.
Is Zionism still the animating idea of the State of Israel? Is there another direction that Israel goes in? Where does Israel go in the 21st century?
Well, having not had a state for 2,000 years, we have secured it again, but we have to assure the Jewish future. That's what Zionism is about, giving the Jewish people the ability to have their own independent state. But you know, this is an ongoing effort. The challenges keep changing. What you want to make sure is that you have the inner strength to confront these challenges and also to make these alliances that I talked about. Nobody makes alliances with the weak, and nobody makes peace with the weak. So the first obligation we have to further the future of Israel is to make sure the country is strong. Strong militarily, but that's expensive. I hope you know that. It's very expensive. So the only way you can actually fund Israel's defenses to safeguard the Jewish future is to have a very vibrant economy. The only way you're going to have a very vibrant economy is to make sure it's a free market economy. That is something that I've devoted a good part of my life to do, and I think that we're successful in doing that, because in Israel, what is happening now is that we are harnessing the power of innovation to the power of free markets. If you have intellectual or even technological brilliance, but you have no free markets, it's not going to go anywhere. The former Soviet Union had incredible metallurgists, incredible physicists, incredible mathematicians, but they were utterly useless. If you put them on the plane and took them to Palo Alto, they were producing value within 3 weeks. Israel had incredible technologists, incredible scientists, incredible. But we had to liberate our markets, which is a process I had something to do with. And as a result, Israel is becoming, I would say, the preeminent, or one of the 2 great centers of innovation in the world. And as a result, our ability to make alliances is shifting. We are now in an extraordinary relationship with 2 small countries in Asia, India and China and Japan. Together we account for roughly 2.5 billion people in the world. Now, they're all coming to this new Israel. You asked, where is Israel going? In the century of conceptual products and knowledge, the ones who will prosper are those who can innovate faster. Israel is a speed chess innovator. We don't have that large a number of innovators, but we have a very, very large number of very fast innovators. And our culture promotes that. So I think Israel is moving into a leadership position in technology. I'll give you a number to illustrate this, because I think it's important that I take this away from general concepts and make it concrete. In 2014, as a result of a deliberate policy that my government is leading, Israel had 10% of the global investments in cybersecurity. That's 100 times our size. In 2015, we track that number, we receive double that amount. We receive 20% of the global investment in cybersecurity. In cyber, we're punching 200 times above our weight. This is an indication of how you can increase your capacities and how you can harness your innate ingenuity, both for national power and for international connections. I read a book by a wonderful writer named Will Durant. Well, he wrote some 12 volumes on history. And towards the end of his life, I think in the late 60s, he wrote a small book. It's 100 pages long. and it's called The Lessons of History. Well worth reading. I suggest AEI reprint it. It's tremendous. Every sentence is potent and pregnant with meaning and insight. And I want to give you the bad news and the good news. The bad news, if I can use the word crystallize what Durant is saying, he says that in history, numbers count. That is, big nations overcome smaller nations because, you know, they have a bigger GDP, so they can have a bigger military and so on and so on. And then I think on page 19 or so he says, there are exceptions sometimes when nations can harness the cultural force. And he says the young state of Israel may be an example of such an exception. Well, half a century later, I think we proved the point. So where do we go? We maintain the defenses of the Jewish state. We develop its economy. We allow our ingenuity to flourish. We become a technological powerhouse. And we hope that in the great battle between modernity and medievalism that afflicts our area, modernity wins. If that happens to be the case, we all win.
There is, though, a great battle going on between modernity and medievalism in your part of the world. And if you talk about democracy being the idea that made Israel strong and markets and capitalism being the idea that will propel Israel into the 21st century and beyond, there are other ideas at play throughout the region. And there are a lot of people who suggest that, that in fact, one of the things that is animating those terrorist groups that have now risen up throughout the region and are tyrannizing most of the people, many of the people of the Middle East, that they're founded on an idea. And that as many drone strikes or airstrikes or even ground wars that happen without having an idea to substitute theirs, that we cannot win. You can't beat something, as one of my colleagues so often says, with nothing. So what I want to ask you is, as the leader of the only truly democratic market economy in the Middle East, what is the idea that is going to beat this? Is it democracy?
It's certainly greater freedom. I think there's a process in which the Arab world and parts of the Islamic world move towards the idea of greater freedom. It's not automatic, but it's certainly a good contrast to the kind of tyranny and savagery that they're experiencing now. And the brunt of this savagery is afflicted on Muslims right now. Millions have been displaced and hundreds of thousands butchered, so they have a pretty good idea of what they don't want. I actually think that sometimes in these kinds of battles, it's first of all important to win physically. Win. Fight. I mean, combating Nazism first involved beating Nazism. You know, you had denazification after you won. You have to win. It's very important not to allow these beasts the freedom to prowl, because what they're doing is they're emptying parts of the Middle East into Europe. They're now going to empty Africa. And you have these two human streams fleeing misery. I spoke to Prime Minister Renzi of Italy and to David Cameron, Prime Minister of Britain, and to Angela Merkel just in the last few weeks. And I said, I don't want to talk about ISIS, that's politically loaded. You can ask me privately later. But I wanted to speak about Boko Haram. I wanted to speak about Al-Shabaab. You know, there must be at least 12, probably closer to 20 leaders of African nations who came to Israel, just as Asia is coming to Israel. And they only want three things from us: Israeli technology, Israeli technology, and Israeli technology. The African states all come and they say, we want Israeli technology in agriculture, in healthcare, in irrigation, whatever. And they all come down to one word: security. Help us in security. So I suggested to some of the European countries a simple partnership. We form consortiums to deal with individual countries, help them with their economy, help them with their security. The Islamist movements in Africa are not yet strong. They can be defeated today. They can be defeated today. It'll be a lot harder tomorrow. And my point is, in addition to the battle of ideas, there's the battle. You have to win the battle. And the earlier you win it, the cheaper it will be. The longer you wait, eventually, these forces will dissipate, because there is no hope, there is no future for a world of darkness. And I think the Islamists will lose out. But it may take decades, it may take half a century. Nazism was defeated, but it claimed the life of millions, tens of millions of people, and a third of my people. I think defeating them early is important. We'll defeat them in the battle of ideas, but let's defeat them on the ground as well.
I hope you won't mind if I press you a little bit more on this question, because there are plenty of voices, I would say, growing in volume, both in the United States and I think even in Israel, who suggest that we are better off with the Gaddafis and the Saddams and the Assads in place to tamp down on the Islamists who rise up, and that secular dictatorship is really the solution that we should look for the rest of the Middle East. Others say that democracy is only fertile ground for Islamists who rise up. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I went to serve in the United Nations 100 years ago as Israel's ambassador, and there was a woman there. Her name was Jean Kirkpatrick. And I had read an article that she had written called Dictatorships and Double Standards. And she said, basically in this article, she said, we are committed to the larger battle against Soviet totalitarianism. And on occasion, we decide for the larger goal to make arrangements with secular dictatorships. That's basically what she said. Now, mind you, Saddam was horrible, horrible, brutal killer. So was Gaddafi. There's no question about that. I had my own dealings with each of them. But I do want to say that they were in many ways neighborhood bullies. That is, they tormented their immediate environment, but they were not wedded to a larger goal. The militant Islamists, either Iran leading the militant Shiites with their proxies Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Hamas, or even though Hamas is Sunni, or the militant Sunnis led by Daesh, by ISIS, they have a larger goal in mind. Their goal is not merely the conquest of the Middle East, it's the conquest of the world. It's unbelievable. People don't believe that. They don't believe that it's possible to have this quest for an imamate or a caliphate in the 21st century, but that is exactly what is guiding them. And against this larger threat that would present two Islamic states, one the Islamic State of Daesh and the other the Islamic Republic of Iran, each one of them seeking to arm themselves with weapons of mass death, chemical weapons in the case of ISIS, nuclear weapons in the case of Iran. That poses a formidable threat to our world. And therefore, if I have to categorize the threats, I would say that these are the larger threats. And it doesn't mean that you have to form alliances with secular dictatorships, it means you have to categorize what is the larger threat. And that is something that I think is required from all of us. Political leadership involves always choosing between bad and worse. I seldom have had a choice between bad and good. I welcome it when it happens, but these are by far the easiest choices. It's choosing between bad and worse that defines a good part of leadership. And I think I know how to choose that.
Let's talk about Syria for a moment, and then I want to turn quickly to Iran. Syria is spiraling out of control. The situation seems to be going from bad to worse. When you think about this, how do you see the implications for Israel? How do you see this affecting Israel? How do you see solutions that Israel can affect?
I have this weakness. I've done a lot of economic reforms in Israel. I think about 50. A lot. You can ask me later about them, but I want to give you
I'm not taking this hint enough.
Well, they want to have dinner, but I want to tell you about that. So these economic reforms, the most difficult problem, contrary to what people think, is actually conceptual. It's getting the concept right, getting the idea right, especially if you can borrow it from others and see where it worked, okay? And then you just have to fit it to your own country. And then you have the battle with all the vested interests and so on, but I find that particularly boring. It's the first part, deciding what is the right thing to do, that always takes the largest effort and also the greatest intellectual investment. And it's pretty easy to do in economics, it's pretty easy to do in education, it's pretty easy to do in other things. If I see a situation where I don't have a clear concept, I don't charge in. In Syria, I do not see a simple concept, because you choose here between a horrible secular dictatorship or the two other prospects, or that would be buttressed by Iran, and you would have Iran run Syria, a horrible prospect for us, or Daesh, which is also there, touching our borders on the Golan. When two of your enemies are fighting each other, I don't say strengthen one or the other, I say weaken both, or at least don't intervene, which is what I've done. I've not intervened. I have acted several years ago, and I think I was the first country to do that, to put a military hospital 10 yards away from our border with the Golan, with Syria, and we've taken in thousands of Syrians, children, women, men, amputated, horrible conditions, given them treatment in Israeli hospitals. We never show their picture, because if their photograph is seen and they're then rehabilitated and they go back to their villages or towns, they'll be executed on the spot. But other than that, I've left the internal battle in Syria untouched, because I'm not sure what to choose, and you have to openly admit it. But here's what I do define in Syria. I don't want Syria to be used as a launching ground for attacks against us. And I have said this to Vladimir Putin when I flew to Moscow to see him. I went to see him first to make sure that our planes don't crash at each other. It's not a good idea. But I told him, here's what we do in Syria. We will not allow Iran to set up a second front in the Golan, and we will act forcefully and have acted forcefully to prevent that. We will not allow the use of Syrian territory from which we'd be attacked by the Syrian army or anyone else. And we have acted forcefully against that. And third, we will not allow the use of Syrian territory for the transfer of game-changing weapons into Lebanon, into Hezbollah's hands. And we have acted forcefully on that. I made it clear that we will continue to act that way. I explained that to Putin. I said, whatever your goals are in Syria, these are our goals, and we'll continue to act that way. And I think that message was received. Now, there is talk now of an arrangement in Syria. And I spoke about it today in a very good conversation I had with President Obama. And I said that any arrangement that is struck in Syria, if one is achievable, I'm not sure. I'm not sure Humpty Dumpty can be put back together again. I have strong doubts. I'm not sure Syria as a state can be reconstituted. But whatever arrangements are made in Syria that do not preclude Iran from continuing its aggression against us directly or by transferring weapons to Hezbollah, that doesn't oblige us. We have very clear policy demands in Syria. We keep them and will continue to keep them. The defense of Israel is what concerns me in Syria, first and foremost, and on that we'll continue to act forcefully.
I know you want to talk about the economy, but let me ask you quickly about Iran, otherwise the audience won't forgive me. The Iranians certainly are embroiled in Syria, but these have been pretty good times for them, actually. We see them interfering in Yemen without too much pushback, in Bahrain, in Lebanon, of course. They're still active in the West Bank and Gaza. They are everywhere without very substantial pushback. Do you see Iran as being constrained or in some way moderating its actions because of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran deal? How do you see Iran's ambitions playing out?
It's no secret we had a disagreement, President Obama and myself, on the nuclear issue. That deal was signed. I think right now we have to concentrate on three things. The first is to prevent Iran from violating the deal. I was concerned with two things about the deal. One, that Iran violates the deal. The other, that Iran keeps the deal. And within 15 years, they have a clear path to producing the enriched uranium for a massive nuclear arsenal. I thought, and I'm still concerned with that aspect of it. But right now, we are in agreement that we want to keep Iran's feet to the fire. We want to make sure they don't violate the deal. And the President and I spoke about that today at some length. So we'll cooperate, first of all, to make sure that Iran doesn't cheat. And believe me, it has a proclivity for cheating. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we have a vested interest, and by we I mean the United States and Israel, not only Israel, to prevent Iran's conventional aggression. Remember that Iran is not only arming Hezbollah, as I described, trying to build a second front in the Golan, supplying Hamas in Gaza and Islamic Jihad with the technology of attack drones, acting in Yemen, trying to undermine Jordan, you name it. Also building an arms industry, 50,000 man strong, that produces submarines, satellites, precision rocketry, and many other advanced weapons. And Iran could pursue this aggression if it's not met with countervailing force. So I think the second thing, other than keeping their feet to the fire, is supporting your allies. And the most important ally and the most important countervailing force for Iran is the state of Israel. Support Israel. If I can be subtle enough, and the President and I discussed today an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding for American military support for Israel for the next 10 years. Imagine the Middle East without Israel. Well, what do you think would happen in our immediate vicinity? I'm the foreign minister, so I have to be diplomatic. I leave it to your imagination. Now imagine a Middle East with 3 Israels. One in Afghanistan, one in Libya, one near Yemen. It'll be a far different situation. The support for Israel that I'm talking about, well, the United States supports Israel to the tune of $3 billion a year, okay? You spent on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq $1.5 trillion. So that's 5 centuries worth of support for Israel. I think Secretary Carter and the President today said that supporting Israel is not just important for Israel, something that we deeply appreciate, but it's also a very solid investment in American security as well. We are an ally that doesn't ask for any American troops. We never have, and we don't intend to. We can defend ourselves. We just want to have the tools. So I think the second thing in fighting Iran is giving Israel the tools to defend itself and deter Iran. And there's a third item that I think is essential. Iran is not merely practicing aggression in the Middle East. Iran is building a terror network in both hemispheres, adding a new terrorist cell roughly every 4 weeks. When I say both hemispheres, that obviously includes the Western Hemisphere, this hemisphere. And I think this terror network that is growing rapidly should be torn apart. So 3 things: keep their feet to the fire, support your allies, this ally first, and third, bring down that terror network. I think that's what I can say about Iran. It'll be left to history to see if Iran will modernize and reform under this clique. I have my doubts. I hope I'm wrong. I suspect I'll be proved right. But I'll be delighted if the Google kids take over Tehran. That has not yet happened.
I think we'll all be delighted. Now, normally I would cut things off because we're about to run out of time, but I want to press you on an issue that I know you're very reluctant to talk about, and that is Israel's economy.
I love that one.
You said, ask me about Israel's economy. You tell us, what do you want people to know? What do you want people to take away? That's going to be my last question, so go for it.
I think the supremacy of free markets is not self-evident. I think it has to be explained. I think the task of leaders is, first of all, to get things conceptually right, but the second is to communicate it effectively. When I became finance minister in the midst of a crisis in 2003, we were in a horrible crisis. Our economy was shrinking, our GDP per capita was shrinking, we had terrible unemployment and so on. And most people thought it was because of the intifada that we had at the time, or the collapse, you remember the NASDAQ bubble bursting and so on. That had an effect on us. And I thought that certainly contributed to it. But I didn't think that was the major problem. And so I had about 3 weeks to come up with an economic plan that ultimately made many, many changes in Israel. But I thought no less intensely about how do I communicate this to a country that doesn't have lemonade stands when you're a kid. You have little cards that when I was a child, and you could see this was a MiG fighter and this was a Missler fighter. That's what we traded as cards. We didn't have lemonade stands. We had a fairly semi-socialist economy. So how do I explain the idea of free markets and their centrality in today's world? And so 3 weeks later, I did a press conference and I said, I want to fall back on my first day in basic training in the Israeli paratroops. The commander put us in a straight line, and he said, you're not going to take a race, but it's a special kind of race. Each man looked to his right. You are the first man, he pointed to me. Put the guy to your right on your shoulders. And the next guy did that. And then a guy after him did that. And I got a pretty big guy, was heavy. The next guy was the smallest guy in the platoon, and he got the biggest guy on his shoulders. And the third guy was a big guy, and he got a small guy, and so on. And then the commander blew the whistle. I barely managed to move forward. The next guy, the guy next to me, the small guy with the big guy on his shoulders, collapsed. And the third guy took off like a rocket, and won the race. And I said, in the modern economies, all national economies are pairs of a public sector sitting on the shoulders of a private sector. In our case, the public sector became too big, too fat, and we're about to collapse. So we have to put the fat man on a diet, and we have to strengthen the guy at the bottom, give him a lot of oxygen in his lungs. That means lowering tax rates. And third, we have to remove the obstacles, the barriers to the race, barriers to competition. By the way, this became known as the fat man, thin man thing, and taxi drivers could repeat it. But effectively, we ended up doing exactly that. We constrained the growth of public spending. We lowered tax rates. I had a big argument about that. They said, who's this guy, Laufer? I said, no, it's not Laufer. His name is Laffer. And we actually tried it, and it works. It worked for us, big time. And we instituted a lot of reforms. I mean, even earlier as prime minister in my first term, I removed all constraints on foreign currency exchange, and that was supposed to collapse our economy. And of course, everybody was warning me that a mountain of money will move. It did into the country, and so we did all these reforms. And the consequence of that is that we grew at 5% a year for a decade, with the exception of 2008. We still grew, but we grew at 5% per decade. And we have now overcome, past many leading economies in the world. And if we continue to adhere to free market principles and encourage innovation and open new markets to the East, new products, new markets, deregulation, and infrastructure, which we're investing in mightily, then I think Israel has a brilliant economic future. The thing that I have to tell you, though, is that although our GDP per capita is rising rapidly, we have a small GDP. We have 8 million people. We can be number one in cyber. We are. We can be number one in many other things, but we're small. And therefore, we have to compensate that with other means. Among others, the American military assistance, which is invaluable. But I think that the race that I described, the thin man, fat man race, is ongoing. You always have to improve the performance of your economy. You have to make sure that government does not interfere with ingenuity, but actually promotes it. And you can never rest on your laurels. Never rest on your laurels. Life is competitive. The life of nations is competitive. You should always hone your competitive edge. This is not something that consultants tell you. It's some things that leaders have to do. You have to hone the competitive edge of your people. And you should have as much alliances as you can with other like-minded states, like the United States of America.
Amen. Let me say.
I think Mr. George Priest asked me to explain why we don't have peace. You have until tomorrow? Here's my short answer. I have two rules when I'm in a press conference, when I have journalists. I put a board on and they ask me the questions. I write all the questions. I write all the questions. And then I go through each one, and here's my answer to that, here's my answer to that, here's my answer to that. And this one, I'm fudging. I don't want to fudge. I actually tell them that I fudge. I don't want to fudge. I want to tell you what the answer is. The reason, first of all, the conflict that we have in the Middle East is multiple. It used to be said that the core of the conflict in the singular in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, that went by the window. When you see Iraq collapsing, Syria collapsing, Yemen collapsing, Libya collapsing, and everything else in turmoil, nothing to do with us. The core of the conflicts in the Middle East is the battle between modernity and early primitive medievalism. That's the core of the conflicts. The core of the specific conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is the persistent Palestinian refusal to recognize a Jewish state in any boundary. This is why this conflict persisted for 50 years before there was a state, before there were territories, before there were settlements. If that were the core of the conflict, the settlements, why did it take place when my grandfather landed in Jaffa in 1920? Jews were murdered then for what? There was no West Bank. There were no settlements. Now that continued in 1921, 1929, 1936, 1939, 1948. What was that all about? 1967. For nearly half a century, we were being attacked because there was a persistent refusal to accept us in any boundary. Well, we got into these territories as a result of the conflict. And what Arab propaganda has done by endless repetition is to turn the result of the conflict into its cause. Now, how do you know that that's the case? Because we left Gaza completely, every last centimeter. And they're still firing rockets at us from Gaza. And when you ask them, why are you doing this? Is it to liberate the West Bank? And they say, yeah, sure, that too, but no, it's to liberate Palestine. You know, Akko, Haifa, Jaffa. They always get back to Jaffa. So now I turn to the other guys, to the Palestinian Authority, not to Hamas. At least they don't practice violence, which is important. And I say, well, what about you? Are you willing to recognize the Jewish state? Are you willing to recognize the fact you'll have a nation state for the Palestinian people? How about a nation state for the Jewish people? I mean, after all, we've only been there almost 4,000 years. And we recognize there are two peoples there. We're willing to make the deal. Are you willing to make the deal? Are you willing to recognize the Jewish state? Because there's no point in making another Palestinian state, another Arab state that will continue the battle from improved lines against the Jewish state. Are you willing to end the conflict? Give up the claim of the so-called right of return. Make peace. And you know what happens when you ask them that? They move. And they say, oh, we're willing to recognize Israel. I didn't ask Israel. I said, are you willing to terminate all claims to the Jewish state? You won't get Jaffa. You won't flood us with refugees. Are you willing to do that? And the answer is they're not. We will have peace when the Palestinians will accord us what they ask us to accord them. We're willing to let them have a state of their own. They have to reconcile themselves to the fact that we have a state of our own, and it's here to stay. That is the core of the problem. In the Middle East, modernity against medievalism, Israel and the Palestinians, the persistent refusal to recognize a Jewish state in any boundary. I hope that changes, but I have my mind on making sure that until it changes, that yes, we work up the economies to create at least an economic vested hope in the future. If the Palestinians follow the prescriptions I've given here for market development, they'll be better off economically and we'll move 2 steps closer to peace too. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.